They fined me for using my own lake like I had no right to it. She stood on my dock with a violation notice, acting like she could control what happened on my property. What she didn't know was that I owned the water she was trying to regulate, and the moment I decided to respond, everything started to turn against her. And 3 days later, I made my move. I turned off the lake at 2:17 in the morning, and the silence that followed sounded louder than any argument they'd ever thrown at me. Louder than Linda Harper's voice when she stood on my dock 3 days earlier, heels clicking against wood my father built with his own hands, waving a violation notice like she owned the air between us, telling me I was being fined $500 a day for unauthorized use of community water. And I remember the smell of wet cedar and algae that morning, the way the sun hit the surface just right, turning the lake into a sheet of gold she thought she could claim with a clipboard and a signature. And I remember thinking, not angry, not even surprised, just quiet, like something old inside me had already seen this coming. Because this wasn't the first time someone mistook paperwork for power, and it definitely wasn't the first time someone underestimated what my family actually owned. The pump station sat half a mile uphill behind a line of pines no one in the neighborhood ever bothered to question. A small concrete structure with a rusted lock that hadn't changed in 20 years, feeding the reservoir through a system older than the HOA itself, older than the subdivision, older than Linda's carefully printed rules laminated in neat little binders. And as I stood there that morning with the fine still folded in my back pocket, I could hear the low mechanical hum beneath the ground, steady, patient, like a heartbeat no one else even knew existed. And Linda kept talking, listing regulations, citing sections, smiling that tight, rehearsed smile people use when they think they're winning, when they think the story is already written in their favor, and I just nodded, because arguing would have ruined the timing, and timing was everything. Later that afternoon they put up signs along the shoreline, private HOA water, cheap metal posts hammered into soil that technically wasn't theirs. And by evening there was a temporary fence blocking the narrow gravel path leading from my backyard to the dock, the same path I'd walked barefoot as a kid, the same path my dad used to carry down fishing rods and coolers on humid July mornings, and I watched from my kitchen window as a couple of board members measured distances and took photos like they were documenting a victory, like they'd just added something permanent to their control. And the funny thing was, they actually believed it. They believed the lake had always been waiting for them to claim it, like it didn't have a history, like it didn't have a source, like water just existed without ownership. That night, I pulled out the old metal box from the bottom shelf in my study, the one with the worn edges and the faint smell of paper and dust, and inside were documents my father made me read when I was 16, deeds, maps, rights agreements written in language so dry most people would have given up halfway through, but I didn't, because he didn't. Let me, he used to say, land isn't just what you see, Ethan, it's what runs under it. And I didn't fully understand that back then, not until I saw Linda standing on my dock acting like the surface was the whole story, and I flipped through those pages again, slower this time, tracing lines that connected property boundaries to something deeper, something buried, something constant. By midnight the neighborhood had gone quiet, porch lights blinking off one by one, the lake reflecting nothing but the moon and the occasional ripple from a night breeze, and I walked out to the edge of my yard, stopping just before the new fence, looking out over water that suddenly felt temporary, not because it didn't belong there, but because I knew exactly what it depended on. And for the first time since the fine showed up, I let myself smile, just a little, because they hadn't taken anything from me. They'd just exposed what they didn't understand, and that made everything easier. The road up to the pump station was empty at 2 a.m., tires crunching softly over gravel as I parked near the tree line. The air colder up there, carrying that faint metallic scent of machinery and damp earth. And when I stepped out, the hum was louder, clearer, like it was waiting for me. And I walked to the door, pulled out the old key from my pocket, the one that didn't look like much but had never failed me. And for a second I just stood there, hand on the lock, listening, thinking about Linda's voice, the signs, the fence, the fine, all of it stacking up like they'd built something real, something permanent. And then I turned the key, slow and deliberate, feeling the mechanism give way with a soft click, the kind of sound that doesn't echo but still carries weight. And inside, the control panel blinked quietly in the dark, steady lights, steady flow, Everything exactly as it had always been, and I reached for the main valve, fingers brushing cold metal, pausing just long enough to let the moment settle in. Not dramatic, not rushed, just precise. Because this wasn't about anger, it was about correction, and when I finally moved, it was smooth, controlled. The hum fading almost instantly as the system responded, like the entire lake had taken a breath and decided not to exhale. And in that silence, standing there alone with nothing but the faint drip of residual water somewhere in the pipes, I knew they were about to learn something they should have asked about first, and by sunrise, the surface would start to change. By sunrise, the lake did not look like a lake anymore. It looked like something unfinished, like a memory fading in real time. The shoreline stretching farther out than it had the day before, exposing damp earth that had not seen daylight in years, and I could smell it before I even stepped outside. That thick, mineral scent of wet soil and old leaves, the kind that clings to your shoes and reminds you that water is never permanent, only borrowed. I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the surface drop inch by inch, subtle enough that no one would notice at first, but constant enough that it would not stop, and right on schedule, around 8:30, the first reaction came, not from Linda, but from one of the neighbors jogging along the path, slowing down, then stopping completely, staring out at the widening strip of exposed ground like something was wrong, but they could not quite explain it. And that is how it always starts, confusion, before panic. By 9:15 my phone buzzed for the first time, an unknown number, then another, and another, until it became a steady rhythm against the counter, each call ignored, each voicemail stacking up with the same tone of forced calm, people asking if I had noticed anything strange, if I knew why the water looked lower, if there was some kind of maintenance happening, and I let it all sit there unanswered, because answering too early would ruin the shape of what was unfolding. And outside, more people had gathered along the fence the HOA installed, leaning over it, pointing, taking pictures, their voices carrying across the open space where water used to reflect sound differently, now sharper, drier, like the lake itself was no longer softening anything. It was just before 10 when Linda arrived, and I did not need to see her to know it was her. I could hear the quick, decisive steps on gravel, the clipped tone of someone already irritated before asking a question, and when I finally stepped out onto my porch, she was standing near the edge of the fence, sunglasses on despite the mild light, holding her phone up as if documenting evidence, turning in a slow circle like the lake had personally offended her. And when she spotted me, her expression shifted into that same tight smile I remembered, the one that pretended to be polite but never quite reached her eyes, and she called out, asking if I had any idea what was going on, her voice carrying just enough authority to make the nearby homeowners go quiet, waiting for my answer like it would explain everything. And I took a slow sip of coffee before responding, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it noticeable. And then I told her I had noticed the water looked a little low, nothing more, nothing less. And for a moment, just a brief moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, like she was trying to decide whether this was still under her control. By noon the difference was undeniable. The lake had receded several feet from the previous shoreline, leaving behind dark streaks along rocks and docks that marked where the water used to sit, a visible timeline of loss. And the HOA board members began to arrive one by one, clustering near Linda, their voices overlapping. Some frustrated, some concerned, all of them looking for a cause they could point to, something they could regulate, fine, or shut down. But there was nothing visible to blame, no broken pipe, no storm damage, no obvious failure, just absence, and absence is harder to control than anything else. Someone suggested calling the county. Another mentioned environmental issues, and Linda, still holding on to her authority like it might slip away if she loosened her grip, started giving instructions, telling people not to panic, telling them the HOA would handle it, that they had jurisdiction over the lake and would ensure everything was resolved quickly. And I almost laughed at that, not out loud, but quietly to myself, because jurisdiction does not mean much when you do not understand the system you are claiming. The sun climbed higher, the smell of wet earth grew stronger, and the exposed ground began to dry at the edges, cracking slightly in thin lines that spread outward like veins. And I watched it all from the shade of my porch, unseen by most of them now. just another homeowner in the background, while the center of attention shifted entirely to the shrinking lake, to the problem no one could yet explain. And as Linda raised her voice, trying to regain control of the situation, I could tell she still believed this was temporary, something she could fix with a meeting or a phone call, or another notice taped to someone's door, and that belief was going to make what came next even harder for her to accept, because the lake was not just lowering, it was following a decision she did not even know had been made, and by the time she realized that, it would already be too late to pretend otherwise, because the shoreline kept moving. By mid-afternoon, the lake had dropped enough that people stopped pretending it was normal. The conversations along the fence grew louder, sharper, no longer curious but edged with concern, and I could hear fragments of it drifting across my yard. Words like drainage, damage, who is responsible, all circling around the same uncomfortable realization that something was happening without anyone's permission. And that alone was enough to make the HOA uneasy, because everything in their world depended on control, on rules being followed, on systems they believed they understood. Linda stood at the center of it again, but this time her posture had changed, the confidence from earlier replaced with something tighter, more rigid, like she was holding herself together through sheer will. Phone pressed to her ear as she paced along the fence line, repeating phrases about property management and community assets, trying to escalate the issue to someone higher, someone who could restore the illusion that this was still within their reach. And when she hung up, she turned immediately toward me, not walking this time, but moving with purpose, cutting across the grass until she stopped just short of my porch, the fine still folded in my pocket like a quiet reminder of how this started. She asked me again, more direct now, if I knew anything about what was causing the water level to drop, and there was no smile this time, no politeness layered over the question, just expectation, like she believed I owed her an answer. And I met her gaze, steady, calm, telling her the lake had always followed its own system, that sometimes levels change, that there are factors people do not always see, and I watched the way that landed, not satisfying, not dismissive, just enough to keep her off balance. And that was when she shifted tactics, reminding me of the violation, of the fines accumulating daily, of the HOA's authority over the lake, her voice firm again, trying to reassert the structure she depended on. And I let her finish before I said anything, because timing still mattered, and when I spoke, it was simple, almost casual. I told her that authority only works when it matches reality. And for a second she did not respond, like she was processing whether that was a challenge or just a statement. And then she turned away, calling over one of the board members, redirecting her attention back to the crowd, back to the problem she thought she could still solve. By 3 o'clock the exposed ground had widened into a rough, uneven ring around what was left of the water, docks now extending out over nothing, boats sitting awkwardly tilted in the mud, their reflections gone, replaced by shadows that looked wrong without the surface to mirror them. And the smell had changed too, stronger now, heavier, a mix of damp earth and something older underneath, something that had been sealed away by water for years. And people were stepping back from the edge, covering their noses, murmuring about health concerns, about safety, about whether this was even allowed to happen. And I could see the shift clearly, the moment when frustration starts turning into blame, when people stop asking what is happening and start asking who is responsible. And that is when control really begins to slip. A county truck eventually rolled up near the entrance, white paint reflecting the afternoon sun, 2 officials stepping out with clipboards and measured expressions, walking the perimeter, taking notes, asking questions that no one could answer with certainty. And Linda moved quickly to intercept them, explaining the situation in terms that made it sound manageable, contained, something the HOA was already addressing. But I could tell by the way the officials looked out over the receding waterline that they were not convinced, because what they were seeing did not match a simple explanation. It looked deliberate, controlled, like a system responding exactly as it was designed to. And that detail matters to people who know how to look for it. I stayed where I was, just within view, but not part of the conversation, listening as bits of their discussion carried over, mentions of water source, of supply lines, of permits, and every word they used brought them closer to something the HOA had never considered, something buried beneath their assumptions. And as the sun began to dip slightly, casting longer shadows across the exposed lakebed. I realized the shift was almost complete, the moment where confusion becomes pressure, where pressure demands answers, and answers start to uncover things no one planned to reveal. And out on the edge of the shrinking water, one of the officials pointed toward the far side of the lake, following a line that only made sense if you knew where it led. And I knew exactly what he was starting to see, because that line did not end at the shoreline. The county official did not say anything at first. He just kept his eyes fixed on that far edge of the lake where the water had pulled back enough to reveal a faint, unnatural line cutting through the mud. Not a crack, not a natural formation, but something too straight, too deliberate, and I could see the moment it clicked for him. The subtle shift in posture, the way he adjusted his stance like he was recalibrating what he thought he was looking at, and he stepped a little closer, boots pressing into the damp ground, following that line with his gaze as if it might lead him somewhere important. Linda noticed it too. Of course she did. And she moved quickly, asking what he was seeing, her voice carrying that same controlled urgency she had been using all afternoon. But there was something different underneath it now, something thinner, like the confidence was starting to stretch too far. And when the official finally spoke, his tone was measured, neutral, but precise. He said it looked like a channel, or maybe part of a controlled inlet system. And that word alone, controlled, hung in the air longer than anything else he had said all day. The second official joined him, crouching down, brushing away a thin layer of wet silt with his glove, revealing more of the structure beneath, a reinforced edge, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. And they exchanged a look, not dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was not random, not environmental, not accidental. And that realization began to ripple outward through the small crowd. Because people pick up on tone before they understand details, and the tone had shifted from investigation to recognition. Linda stepped closer, heels sinking slightly into the soft ground, asking again what it meant. And this time there was no attempt to soften the answer. The official explained that if there was a controlled system feeding or maintaining the water level, then the drop was likely intentional or at least the result of a managed change, not a natural fluctuation. And I watched her process that, watched the way her expression tightened just enough to give it away. Because intentional meant someone was responsible, and responsibility meant authority might not be where she thought it was. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the exposed lakebed, highlighting shapes that had been hidden for years: old rocks, submerged logs, even the faint outline of what used to be the original creek path before the reservoir was expanded. And with each inch the water retreated, more of the system revealed itself, not all at once, but in pieces, enough to suggest design, enough to make it clear that this lake was not just sitting there by chance. It was being held, maintained, directed, and that idea alone started to fracture the narrative the HOA had been relying on. The board members gathered tighter around Linda now, their earlier confidence replaced with quiet conversations, heads leaning in, voices lowered, as if speaking softer might somehow contain what was happening. And I could see the shift in their body language, the subtle distance they were beginning to create between themselves and the situation. The way people do when they sense something is about to turn against them. And through all of it, the officials continued their slow, methodical inspection, walking the perimeter, taking notes, occasionally glancing toward the higher ground beyond the trees, following lines that connected things most people never noticed. I stayed on my porch, still, steady, letting it unfold without interference, because stepping in too early would only give them something to push against, and right now they had nothing solid to hold on to, just questions stacking on top of each other, each one pointing a little closer to something they had overlooked, something they never thought to ask about when they were putting up signs and issuing fines. As the light began to fade, one of the officials straightened up and turned toward Linda, asking a simple question about documentation, about who held the rights to the water source feeding the lake. And for the first time since this started, she did not answer immediately. She hesitated, just long enough for everyone nearby to notice. And in that small pause, that brief gap where certainty should have been, the entire situation shifted again, because hesitation in front of a crowd is louder than any statement. And I could see it in their faces, the homeowners, the board, even the officials, all waiting for something that did not come as quickly as it should have. And that was when I knew the next step was no longer mine to initiate, because the question had already been asked, and it was not going away, and somewhere behind the trees, beyond the edge of what they could see, the answer was already sitting there, waiting to be found, and it was only a matter of time before someone followed the line far enough to reach it. The hesitation did not last long, but it did not need to, because once doubt shows up in front of a crowd, it spreads faster than any explanation can contain, and I could see it moving through the group like a quiet current. Homeowners glancing at each other, board members shifting their weight, the officials standing just a little straighter, waiting for an answer that suddenly mattered more than anything else that had been said all day. And Linda finally responded, but it came out slower, less certain. Something about community management and shared access, words that sounded official but did not actually answer the question, and the official did not interrupt her. He just listened, then nodded slightly, and wrote something down on his clipboard, the kind of small, controlled reaction that carries more weight than any argument. The lake had dropped even further by then, enough that the original contours of the land were beginning to show, subtle slopes and channels that hinted at a design most people had never noticed, and the line they had been following earlier was clearer now, a shallow trench reinforced along one edge, leading away from the basin toward the higher ground, and one of the officials pointed it out again, this time tracing it visually for the others, explaining how it likely connected to a managed inflow, something regulated, something controlled from a single point rather than spread across the property. And that idea shifted everything, because a single point means a single source, and a single source means a single owner. I could feel the weight of that realization settling over the group, not all at once, but piece by piece, as people started asking different kinds of questions, not about the water level anymore, but about where it came from, who maintained it, who had the authority to change it. And those questions did not have easy answers inside the HOA structure, because they had never needed to ask them before. They had assumed the lake was just there, part of the landscape, something that came with the neighborhood, like the sidewalks or the streetlights. And assumptions are comfortable until they are not. Linda tried to regain control again, stepping forward, raising her voice slightly, insisting that the HOA would handle any necessary investigation, that they had protocols, that they would coordinate with the county if needed. But even as she spoke, the officials were already moving, following the exposed line farther along the edge of the lake, heading toward the trees where the ground began to rise, and people started to follow them, not because they were told to, but because curiosity had replaced compliance. And once that shift happens, authority becomes harder to maintain. I watched them from my porch as the group slowly migrated away from the shoreline, a loose line of people stepping carefully over uneven ground, shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil, all of them drawn towards something they could not fully see yet. And I could hear bits of conversation drifting back, speculation, confusion, a few voices already edging toward frustration, because not knowing who controls something is more unsettling than knowing you do not control it at all. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm, fading light through the trees, and the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of exposed earth farther across the property. And I took a slow breath, letting it settle, because this was the part most people rush through, the part where answers start to form but have not fully arrived yet, and rushing it would only blur the clarity that was building. The officials reached the edge of the tree line and paused, scanning the area, looking for signs of infrastructure, anything that connected the visible system to something hidden. And one of them gestured toward a narrow path, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look, a path that curved upward along the slope, partially obscured by brush, and I could see the recognition starting to take shape again, not just in them, but in a few of the older residents who had been around long enough to remember pieces of the past, fragments of information that had never seemed important until now. Linda stayed closer to the back of the group this time, still present, still trying to project control, but no longer leading, and that alone said more than anything she had said all day, because leadership is not about where you stand, it is about where people look, and right now, no one was looking at her. They were all looking up that path, towards something just out of sight, something that connected every question they had been asking to a single place. And as the first of them stepped forward to follow it, I knew they were about to find exactly what they had been missing, because the path did not end where they expected it to. The first person to step onto the path did it cautiously, like they were not entirely sure they were allowed to, and that hesitation rippled through the rest of them, slowing the group just enough to make every movement feel deliberate, every footstep pressing into dirt that had not been walked on in years. And from where I stood, I could see the line forming, officials in front, a few curious homeowners close behind, and the HOA board trailing slightly, no longer setting direction but following it. And that shift was subtle but unmistakable, because authority had quietly changed hands without anyone announcing it. The path itself was narrow, barely more than a worn strip through low brush and scattered pine needles, curving upward along the slope toward the tree line where the land leveled out. And as they moved higher, the sounds from the lake faded, replaced by the softer noise of footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. And I knew exactly what they were about to see before they saw it, because I had walked that same path more times than I could count, long before any of these houses existed, long before anyone thought to question where the water came from. The first official reached the clearing and stopped, not abruptly, but in that measured way people stop when they recognize something significant, and the rest of the group slowed behind him, one by one stepping into view of the small concrete structure sitting just beyond the trees, its surface weathered but intact, edges clean, functional, not decorative. And for a moment, no one said anything, because recognition takes a second to settle when it does not match expectations. From a distance, it did not look like much, just a low building with a metal door and a faint discoloration along the ground where water had once flowed more visibly. But up close, it carried a different presence, the kind that signals purpose, design, and most importantly, control. And I could see the officials already reading it, noting the layout, the positioning relative to the lake, the elevation that made everything below it dependent on what happened inside that structure. Linda arrived a few steps later, slightly out of breath, her pace faster than before, but lacking the same certainty. And when she saw it, really saw it, her expression shifted again, not confusion this time, but something closer to realization, like a piece of information she had never considered was suddenly impossible to ignore. And she asked what it was, but the question sounded different now, less like a demand and more like an attempt to catch up. One of the officials stepped forward, examining the exterior, pointing out the reinforced piping running from the base of the structure down toward the lake, partially buried but now easier to trace because of the drop in water level. And he explained in a calm, even tone that this appeared to be part of a managed water system, likely controlling inflow to the reservoir. And as he spoke, the group grew quieter, because the implications were starting to align in a way no one could dismiss. I stayed where I was, still at a distance, letting them discover it on their own, because discovery carries more weight than explanation, and I could see the exact moment it connected. For some of them, the way their posture changed, the way their attention shifted from the structure to each other, as if silently asking how they had missed this, how something so fundamental had been sitting just out of sight the entire time. Linda stepped closer to the door, reaching out as if to open it, then hesitating, her hand hovering just short of the handle. And that hesitation said more than anything else, because it meant she understood, at least partially, that this was not something she controlled, not something she could simply access or regulate with a policy or a vote. And when she finally turned back toward the officials, asking who was responsible for maintaining it, there was no authority left in the question, just urgency. One of the officials glanced down at his notes, then back at the structure, and said that installations like this are typically tied to specific property rights, not community management, and that ownership would be documented, traceable, legally defined. And as those words settled into the space, I could feel the shift complete, the moment where assumption gives way to fact, where belief meets structure, and structure does not bend to opinion. The air up there felt cooler, quieter, the kind of silence that comes before something is fully understood, and I watched as the official reached for the door, pausing just long enough to confirm what he was about to do. And in that brief stillness, with everyone focused on that single point, I knew the next step would not require me at all, because the system was about to speak for itself, and once it did, there would be no room left for interpretation, because the name on that door was not hers. The official's hand rested on the metal handle for just a second longer than necessary, Like even he understood that whatever was on the other side of that door was about to settle every question that had been building all day. And when he finally pulled it open, the hinges gave a low, controlled sound. Not rusted, not stuck, just used. Like this place had not been abandoned at all, just ignored by the wrong people. And inside, the air shifted immediately, cooler, carrying that faint mechanical scent of steel and water systems, clean and functional. And the group instinctively leaned in without stepping fully inside. As if crossing that threshold required permission they suddenly were not sure they had. I could see the panel from where I stood, not clearly, but enough to recognize the layout. The same steady arrangement of gauges and valves I had looked at just hours before, now quiet. No hum, no movement, just stillness. And that stillness spoke louder than anything else in that moment. Because systems like this are not silent unless someone makes them silent. One of the officials stepped forward, scanning the interior with practiced focus, eyes moving from the control panel to the piping, then to the documentation mounted on the wall, and that was where his attention stopped, not abruptly, but firmly, like he had found the piece he was looking for, and he reached out, brushing a bit of dust from the surface of a metal plate fixed beside the main controls, revealing the engraved lettering beneath. And even from a distance, I knew exactly what it said, because I had read it more times than I could count growing up, my father standing beside me, tapping it with his finger like it mattered more than anything else in that room. The official read it quietly at first, then again, a little louder, enough for the others to hear, and as the name carried out into the open air, I watched the reaction ripple through the group, confusion giving way to recognition for some, disbelief for others, and for Linda, something sharper, something immediate, like the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not correct. She stepped closer to the doorway, peering inside, her eyes moving quickly across the equipment before settling on that same plate, and I could see her lips part slightly as she read it for herself, confirming what she had just heard. And for a moment, she did not say anything, no argument, no correction, just silence, because there are certain kinds of information that do not leave room for interpretation, and this was one of them. One of the board members asked what it meant, his voice lower now, cautious, and the official answered in that same measured tone, explaining that the name on the system indicated ownership and operational control of the water supply feeding the lake, not shared, not communal, but singular, tied to a specific property and legally protected under established water rights. And as he spoke, each word seemed to settle heavier than the last, building a structure of understanding that no one could easily push aside. I stayed where I was, letting the distance hold, because stepping forward now would change the dynamic too quickly, and this was not about confrontation. It was about clarity, and clarity works best when it is allowed to form without interruption. Linda finally turned away from the doorway, her expression no longer composed, the edges of her control worn down by something she could not argue with. And she looked out across the trees toward the lake, toward the shrinking water line, toward the signs and the fence, and everything she had put in place as if it had always belonged to her. And I could see the connection forming, slow but undeniable, the realization that the system feeding that lake did not answer to her authority, did not recognize her rules, and had never been part of the structure she thought she managed. The officials continued their inspection, noting details, documenting the setup, but the energy had shifted completely now, no longer searching for a cause, but confirming a fact, and the fact was simple, even if the implications were not, because once ownership is established, everything built on top of a false assumption starts to unravel. A few homeowners began to step back, quietly, the kind of retreat that happens when people realize they have been standing on the wrong side of something, and the conversations that followed were softer, more careful, as if volume alone might draw attention to how quickly their understanding had changed. I could feel the moment settling into place, the point where questions stop multiplying and answers begin to narrow, and as the official stepped back out of the structure, closing the door behind him with that same controlled motion, he turned toward the group, toward Linda, toward the lake below, and I knew he was about to say what none of them were ready to hear, because the name on that plate did not leave anything open to interpretation, and it was only a matter of seconds before someone looked at me and connected it all together. The moment the official stepped out of the structure, the entire group seemed to pause without being told to, like everyone was waiting for permission to understand what they had just seen. And when his eyes moved across the crowd, they did not linger on Linda this time. They moved past her, scanning until they landed on me, standing at the edge of the clearing, still, quiet, exactly where I had been the entire time. And that was when everything connected in a way no one could ignore. He did not point. He did not announce it dramatically. He simply asked a question in a tone that carried certainty rather than curiosity, asking if I was Ethan Cole. And even before I answered, I could feel the shift ripple outward, the way people turned, the way their attention followed his line of sight, all of it converging in a single direction that had been there all along, but had never been considered important until now. I stepped forward slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just closing the distance at a pace that matched the weight of the moment. And when I confirmed my name, the silence that followed was different from anything earlier that day. It was not confusion anymore. It was recognition, the kind that rearranges everything people thought they understood. The official nodded once, then explained, clearly and without embellishment, that the system controlling the water supply to the lake was registered under my name, tied to my property, legally documented and fully within my rights to operate. And as he spoke, each word seemed to land with precision, not loud, not aggressive, just undeniable. And I watched as the meaning settled into the group, one person at a time, expressions shifting, postures changing, conversations stopping mid-sentence as people recalibrated what they had been standing in front of all day. Linda did not speak immediately, and that alone said more than anything she could have said, because she had been the first to speak every time before, the one setting the tone, defining the situation, and now she was still, eyes fixed on me with a mix of disbelief and something sharper underneath, like she was trying to find a version of events where this did not undo everything she had built her authority on. One of the board members finally broke the silence, asking what it meant for the lake, his voice uncertain now, and the official answered with the same calm clarity, explaining that if the water source was privately owned and controlled, then the lake itself was dependent on that system, and any regulations imposed by the HOA that conflicted with those rights would not hold, not legally, not practically, and the weight of that statement settled heavily, because it did not just explain the present situation, it redefined everything that had come before it. I could see it in their faces, the realization that the signs, the fines, the fence, all of it had been built on an assumption that no longer existed, and assumptions do not collapse. Quietly, when they are tied to authority, they unravel in front of everyone who believed in them. Linda finally stepped forward, closing the distance between us with a controlled pace that looked deliberate but felt strained. And when she spoke, her voice was lower, more measured, asking why I had not said anything sooner, why I had let it get this far. And I met her gaze, steady, not confrontational, just clear, and told her that she never asked the right question, and that answer seemed to land harder than anything else, because it shifted the responsibility back to where it had started. The wind moved lightly through the trees, carrying the faint smell of the drying lake bed up into the clearing. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the situation had reached a point where action required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires acceptance, and not everyone was ready for that yet. The official closed his notebook, the quiet snap of it echoing more than it should have, and he explained that from this point forward, any further actions involving the lake would need to respect the established ownership and control of the water system. And that statement did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a boundary, clear and immovable. And as it settled into place, I could see the structure of the situation realigning itself, not through force, not through argument, but through fact. Linda looked back toward the lake one more time, toward the exposed shoreline, the tilted docks, the empty space where water used to be, and then back at me. And in that look, I could see the exact moment she understood what had actually happened, not just today, but from the very beginning, because this was never about the lake alone. It was about what fed it, what sustained it, what gave it value. And as that realization settled in fully, the last piece of control she thought she had slipped away without making a sound. And that was when I knew she was finally ready to hear what came next. What came next was not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of moment people clap for. It was quieter than that, steadier, the kind of shift that settles in and stays. and I took a step closer, just enough to close the space between us without turning it into a confrontation. And I told Linda that the fines she issued were not just unenforceable. They were filed against property and resources that were never under her authority to regulate. And as I spoke, I could see the words land differently now. Not as resistance, not as argument, but as correction, the kind that cannot be negotiated once it is understood. The officials remained where they were, not interrupting, just observing, because their role had already shifted from investigation to confirmation, and everything after that belonged to the people involved. And I reached into my back pocket, pulling out the folded notice she had given me. The paper slightly creased from the way it had been sitting there all day, and I held it up for a second before handing it back to her, not aggressively, just returning something that never should have been issued. In the first place, she took it without speaking, her eyes moving across the document as if seeing it for the first time, and for a brief moment, the weight of it showed, not just the fine itself, but everything it represented, every assumption, every decision built on something that had never been verified. One of the board members asked what would happen to the lake now, his voice careful, like he was stepping into unfamiliar territory, and I answered honestly, not to intimidate, not to prove a point, but because clarity mattered more than anything else at this stage. I told him that the system could be restored, that the water level could return, but it would be done under the same rights that had always governed it, not under new rules written without understanding. And that answer seemed to settle something in the group. Not relief exactly, but a recalibration, like they were adjusting to a version of reality they had not considered before. Linda finally looked up from the paper, meeting my eyes again. And this time there was no attempt to assert control, no immediate response, just a quiet acknowledgement of where things stood. And that silence was more honest than anything she had said earlier, because it meant she understood the boundary she had crossed and the one she could not cross again. The sun had dropped lower now, casting a softer light across the clearing, and from up there, you could see the lake below, reduced, reshaped, its edges pulled back to reveal the structure beneath. And it looked different, not broken, just exposed, like something that had been misunderstood was finally being seen clearly. The officials began to wrap up their notes, one of them mentioning that any further disputes would need to be handled through proper legal channels. But even that felt like a formality now, because the core issue had already been resolved in a way no document could override. And as they stepped away from the structure, the group began to disperse. Slowly, conversations quieter, more thoughtful, people no longer trying to control the situation but understand it. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, looking out over the trees toward the lake, listening to the absence of that steady hum I had turned off hours earlier, and it did not feel like victory, not in the loud sense people expect. It felt like alignment, like something had been put back into its correct place without needing to force it. Behind me, I could hear footsteps fading, doors closing, engines starting, the normal sounds of a neighborhood trying to return to routine, but I knew it would not be quite the same, because once people see how something actually works, they cannot unsee it, and that changes how they move forward. Linda walked past me on her way back down the path, slowing just slightly as she reached my side, and for a second it felt like she might say something, but she did not. She just gave a small nod, not agreement, not apology, just acknowledgement, and continued on without another word. And that was enough, because not every resolution needs to be spoken out loud. I turned back toward the path leading up to the structure, the door now closed again, the system quiet but intact, waiting, and I knew that when the time was right, I would restore the flow, not because anyone demanded it, not because of pressure or expectation, but because it was mine to manage, and that distinction mattered more than anything else that had happened today, because control is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who understands what is actually theirs. And as I stood there in the fading light, I realized they finally understood that too, even if they had not said it yet. And down below, the lake waited for its water to return.